So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Peter Bergerman, and I'm very, very happy to do this podcast with my friend and colleague, Yaakov Yadgar, for the European Association of Israel Studies webinar series. I'm going to talk with Yaakov today about his new book called Israel's Jewish Identity Crisis, State and Politics in the Middle East. And the book provides, I would say, a novel analysis of the interplay between Israeli nationalism and Jewish tradition, arriving at a fresh understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through its focus on internal questions about Israeli identity. Yaakov, really congratulations on the new book.
Thank you.
I suppose a good place to begin would be to ask you, in fact, what your motivation in the first place for the book was.
Thank you, Peter. I think my motivation has been primarily a sense that there's a discourse, a conversation going on that completely misses the point. And I am hoping my intervention at least highlights some of those unasked questions, these assumptions that are taken for granted by a whole field. Let's put it under religion and politics, or nationalism and religion in Zionism and in Israel. More specifically, there's an assumption regarding the applicability of the binary, the dichotomy between religion and politics, or between the religious and the secular, between state and church, or translated to Hebrew and Jewish, state and synagogue. And then a following up of this story of how it plays in among Zionist ideologues and during Ottoman and mandatory Palestine, and then in the state of Israel. I think the picture is obviously much more complex. It almost goes without saying, right, that when you look at Zionism's own claim to Jewish nationalism, not to any kind, not Zionist nationalism, not Israeli nationalism post 1948, and you account for Zionism's own, how would I say, uncomfortable relationship with its own Jewish history, it's clear that something else is playing out there. And the book is an attempt to at least follow up some of the threads of this identity problem or identity crisis. It's a crisis when it becomes a matter of a state, when it becomes a problem or an identity drama with an army, then it's a crisis.
Right. And I suppose, I mean, when you talk about religion and politics, I'm going to push you a little bit on that, and I know you very well. So I mean, we're really talking about, in this respect, Ashkenazi religion. I mean, Ashkenazi religion and politics, right? Ashkenazi Judaism as a national kind of expression and politics.
No doubt. I think it could have, the title of the book could be also, about European Jewish or Ashkenazi Jewish identity crisis. No doubt. The problem, both the conceptual and the historical or socio-historical narratives I have in the book are primarily, if not exclusively, Ashkenazi, as in European. They're mostly East European, actually. I mean, they are obviously Central European actors. We start and end, in a sense, with Herzl. But the project itself is carried out by East European Jews with their specific history and their work, and more importantly, with their conceptions of Jewish identity and how it plays out. And they set out an infrastructure, not just a political infrastructure, but sociocultural infrastructure in Palestine and then Israel, into which Jews who are not Ashkenazim, Jews who come from from the East or the Middle East and from North Africa, are then expected or demanded to adapt. So the problem emerges in Europe, but these people are not free from it. The Mizrahim or the Arab Jews and Jews from the Middle East and of North Africa, they are caught up in a new scheme of Jewish identity. They have to re-understand and reinterpret. For example, they have to find themselves, just to give a very crude example, they have to find themselves on this supposed axis that moves between the religious and secular, and they have to identify if they are religious and secular, and somehow end up in the middle as traditional or Masorti. After my book came out, I read Mahmoud Mamdani's new book, which is called Neither Settler Nor Native, or Neither Native. So I'm sorry, Mahmoud, if he's following this, where dealing with Israel, he actually employs a very fascinating term to describe this phenomena. He calls it the Judaization of the Arab Jews.
Right.
And that's why it's not that they were not Jewish earlier. It's just that when they came to Israel post 1948, they were now expected, demanded, pressured to fit in with this new reading, politicized reading of Jewish identity, with the whole baggage of its unresolved nature.
Right. So in that case, then, what is so Jewish about this particular Jewish state, or this concept of the Jewish state? Yes, what is not so Jewish, perhaps?
Well, exactly. Or what does it mean for Israel to be a Jewish state? I think that's the main question that hovers over the book and hovers over the topics I deal with in the book. Very schematically, I would put it this way. There are two conflicting even, at least divergent, but very often conflicting understandings or political horizons of the very title Israel as a Jewish state. And one would actually be uncomfortable with the idea of a Jewish state, and it would insist that the Juden state is Medinat HaYehudim. It's a state of Jews, and not a Jewish state. Here, Israel's Jewish identity would be very constrained, limited to the very crude fact, only very crude fact of the arithmetic of descent within the population over which it's sovereign. So in other words, to put it simply, Israel is a state of Jews as long as a majority of its population is considered to be Jews, the definition of which, let us leave for a second, because the state does not offer its own definition for this, but that's it. Any demand beyond that the state is called or functions as a Jewish state is read in this perspective as necessarily bringing about a religious element, and then religious coercion, and then hurting the liberal democratic aspirations of the state. Another reading would ask the question that you ask: what's Jewish about it? Right. So there would be an outside perspective, a Jewish outside perspective, whatever this would mean, because we know by definition of tradition that it would be an argument about this topic. But we can see how a conversation that asks about Jewish ethics, Jewish tradition, Jewish practices, Jewish values would then expect the state to fit in, or at least to loyally correspond, let's put it this way, with Judaism.
Right, and I suppose the closest we do get to a definition by the state of who is a Jew is the law of return. I mean, so basically they don't ask any of these questions; they ask about your grandparents, and that's kind of as far as it goes. And this is often, and perhaps somebody who might qualify under this definition is absolutely at odds with someone who might qualify from let's say a halakhic definition, or from there's already a contradiction, I suppose.
So famously, the law of return is, is a clause in the immigration laws, right? It right. describes who is eligible for the Ole certificate or the Ole visa, the kind of certificate that would endow one with almost immediate citizenship when coming to Israel. And this does not have anything specific about defining a Jewish identity. It actually says, the law itself says that the definition of a Jewish belonging or not belonging, that is the belonging to the Jewish people, would be left to the rabbis, the Orthodox rabbis, and their interpretation of halakha.
Right.
I'm asking in the book, and I'm asking, my students when we talk about it, a very simple question, but highly explosive, right? How does one join in the nation? Not just the citizenship, not just getting a passport, but how does one join in the nation in the name of which Israel is sovereign? All right, I'm born out of the Jewish ancestry. I come to love the Jewish people and the Israeli people, and I want to be part of its embodiment in the state of Israel. What do I need to do? To be like most Israelis, to be a secular or a non-Orthodox Jew living in the state does not offer an answer. It doesn't offer a venue. It actually sends these persons to the rabbis, who would then employ their interpretation very loyally, their interpretation of Orthodox law or of Jewish law, to demand that he or she become an practicing Orthodox Jew before they do that. Obviously, there's a tension here, and we see this with matters of conversion being politicized in Israel.
And you talk about this, but before you do, I'd like to read you a quote from your own book, which you note where you note the inherent, and I quote now, the inherent tension or contradiction between, on one hand, a secularist discourse and conceptual framework born out of the history and politics of the modern European nation state, which is the key point, which designates secular rational politics and religion into separate realms of human life. And on the other hand, the particularities of Zionist and Jewish histories, which do not obey this framework's expectations. And that's the end of the quote. Now, to illustrate this point, you use the example of religious conversion, which is why I'm bringing it in, to show that in present-day Israel, it's difficult, if not impossible, to separate the phenomenon of Israeli nationhood from the idea of Jewish nationhood. So I wonder if you could just walk us through this argument a little bit.
Yeah, well, anyone who's reading the Israeli news should know, or the news about Israel, should know that religious conversion is a matter of political contestation in Israel. So already the very terms of the discourse confuse these supposedly two distinct realms. We would expect religious conversions to be a matter of the synagogue or state, or the church, right, or the church equivalent, and the state to focus on citizenship. But in Israel, as it happens, given this Jewish identity crisis, or it's Israel's and Zionism's inability to account for their own claim for Jewish identity, and specifically their inability to answer my previous question, so how does one join in the Jewish nation? Right. The practice has been established that the state outsources this matter to a body which it funds and authorizes, but doesn't work under the same ideology of nation-statism.
Right.
It endows specifically Orthodox rabbis with the role of being gatekeepers of the Jewish nation. This obviously creates tension and confusion. And unfortunately, again, if you read the same reports, you would usually get the same story. Why is it so? It's so because the relatively small minority of Orthodox Jews managed to coerce and to exert, accommodations from the majority of secular Jews because of coalitional considerations, because they have the power in Israel's political system to do so. I think that it's much more complicated than that. I think they are fulfilling a very important function for the state itself.
Right.
And given that the state itself is unwilling or unable to take on this question, famously when Ben-Gurion was trying to supposedly handle this, what he did was to, again, outsource conflicting views to show there's no answer. So what do? You leave it to someone else to answer.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
And I'm sorry, and maybe more difficult to discuss, but still necessary to mention in this regard, is that a reliance on religious conversion as the gate through which one joins a nation that sees itself as not religious, also has some uncomfortable racial tones, because it from the rabbi's point of view, race is irrelevant.
Right.
What's important is practice and belief. So if you study and you convert and you become Jewish according to their understanding of Jewish law, then you would be a practicing Orthodox Jew wherever you are. Right. But the one element that seems to strike a note, with the majority of non-religious or non-Orthodox Israelis, is that the jumping over a threshold from being a non-Jew to Jew.
Right.
So blood, quote unquote, blood equivalent conversion.
Right. So, but this is exactly, I suppose, coming at this from a different way, there's a certain complicity with this silent majority or with the secular majority, because I mean, having kind of, let's say, had a lot to do with the Israeli reform movement and stuff, I suspect there's a certain amount of disdain, even for the secular Israelis, towards progressive Judaism or towards other movements in Judaism. So they don't want to go to shul, but they also don't want, but they also still want to kind of hold for themselves this definition of who is a Jew. And it's kind of, you want to have your cake and eat it too, on some level.
Maybe even in a more visceral, or I wouldn't know how to call it, level, or more fundamental level, most Israeli Jews would not want their children to marry non-Jews.
Right.
And this is where the complicity comes to play. If you are, individually or as a family, are completely indifferent to matters of Jewish education, of Jewish practice, of Jewish, the maintenance of Jewish identity, you are complicit in the sense that you allow the state to maintain it for you.
Yeah.
And then the state plays the gatekeeper through the rabbi. So, and you can see it. You can see in the Israeli press, even the liberal press, such as Haaretz, a certain anxiety surrounding intermarriage or marriage between Jews and non-Jews, inside and outside of Israel. This is how we count the Jewish world, right? If someone marries out, there's an issue of, do we count them in or out? In the case of the Jewish state, it is the case that the people functioning as the gatekeepers and also the upholders of the distinction between Jews and non-Jews are the Orthodox rabbis.
Right, but if we talk, so to go back to this kind of complicit, silent, secular majority, I mean, it's not even a question, forget about marrying a convert or something, or, what about, if a kid marries somebody who wants to get, two Jewish kids or two Israelis who want to be married in a Reformed synagogue, I think there would already be a lot of words back and forth about this. And I have friends, who are basically in their heads, long traditions of reform stretching back to Germany and Austria, but when it's time for the son to be bar mitzvah, they go to an Orthodox shul because it's a really there's a strange tension perhaps within people themselves.
I agree. I think one way to understand this, there's a larger question here, Peter, which I'm not dealing with in the book in much detail, but is obviously relevant. The question of the lack of success, let's not say it differently, not label it as failure, but relatively lack of success of the two largest denominations in the Jewish world to gain hold in Israel. Absolutely. Right? Conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism.
Absolutely.
I think and this goes to, my comments earlier, I think part of the answer to this lack of success is the acceptance among secularist Zionist ideologues.
Yes.
That the one authentic expression of Judaism which they reject is Orthodox Jewry. Yeah. So it's the upkeeping of the binary. And Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism are seen in this regard as disrupting the binary, and they are pushed aside.
Right. So I'm going to change the subject a little bit. It's something that's I would say is very kind of burning topic, certainly around the time when you're writing the book. And in the book, you undertake a detailed discussion of the genesis, the development of the relatively new Chok Leumi, or the Basic Law, Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, which the Knesset passed 2.5 years ago, I guess now almost 3 years. Is this law a historical watershed, or as you say, an obvious, outright, redundant repackaging of the Zionist goal? And where do you think is the greater Zionist ideological dishonesty, to use a provocative term? And go back to perhaps what we were talking about earlier, with the traditional nationalist Zionist right, or with the liberal Zionist left?
Oh, right. First of all, I have to note that the labeling of the law as both redundant and radical is not mine. These are both labels that were given by Israeli commentators, sometimes the same commentator. That was so fascinating about it. Yeah. It's one of those expressions of Zionist ideology and Israeli political culture that maybe, how should I say, it brought to the foreground elements that were always in the background, and once they were exposed to the sun, so to say this way maybe, once they were, made explicated, then the debate ranged. I think at least a good way to begin and understand what is happening around this basic law, is to see it exactly as torn between these two readings of what does it mean for Israel to be a Jewish state. As I mentioned earlier, if there's a state of Jews reading and a Jewish state reading, if there's one reading by which Israel is first and only a state of Jews, then the law fits in very well in demanding basically the preferential treatment of Jews. It's undemocratic, it's highly problematic from a liberal point of view, but it fits in a nationalist arithmetic of majority and minority. So the law says Israel is a majority Jewish state. It has to observe the rights of this Jewish majority and to sustain and maintain the difference between Jews and non-Jews. But the law also, when the debate ranged around it and it was then formulated, somehow falls into attempts at defining Israel as a Jewish state, and it does a very clumsy work at that. It's this reluctant secularist, also kind of liberal, but yeah, secular Zionist mindset that tries to say something positive about its relations to Jewish heritage and education. Yeah. And it's fascinating to follow not just the final bill that passed and became basic law in Israel, but also those elements that were introduced and then were left out. Regarding, for example, can the Israeli courts rely on a Jewish law as a source of inspiration? Right. Or would this necessarily amount to religious coercion and illiberal legislation? It's fascinating to see how the discussion goes around it and basically left unanswered.
Right. And kind of, I would say there's the dichotomy certainly within many people themselves. I see many illiberal liberals, or for lack of a better way of saying it, that they kind of like to think on one hand we're very, very liberal, but on the other hand, perhaps on a more religious level, there's a lot of illiberal, certainly a lot of illiberal attitudes. And this is why I've always never understood, what the problem was, I suppose, with the lack of, or why there's such a lack of popularity with Israeli reform. Is it because it's too American? Is it because of the ideology itself? I don't know. I mean, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah. First of all, let us say about the law itself. Maybe to catch up your last part of your last question. It's important to note that the law itself was promoted from the get-go by the non-religious parts of the Israeli parliament. I don't want to call them secular, because secular doesn't mean anything anymore in this context, but self-identified secular. Yeah. Maybe we should mention it here that the original initiator of the law, at least the one who presented it to the Knesset, was the former head of the Shin Bet, Avi Dichter, who is not identified as a religious Jew in any manner. But more importantly so, it has been objected, the bill has been objected by the Orthodox parties throughout, except for the religious Zionists, because it fit in with the Zionist ideology. But the Haredi or the Orthodox parties have continuously rejected. They cave in last minute, probably for coalitional benefits they received. We still don't have a clear picture of what made them change their mind. I mean, there are different journalistic reports on this, but what's clear is that for 10 years going, as the bill was debated, they objected. They just said, we're not supporting in it. While it was hard to gauge why the political leaders object, as I do in the book, I just read some of those social media comments by people who identify Haredim, and the argument was very clear. Israel is not a Jewish state. It cannot claim a Jewish identity. So what is this distraction here? For Israel to be a Jewish state, according to their understanding, it would have to abide by some Jewish constitution, let's call it this way.
Right. So I think I'm going to change the subject yet again, because I have a few things to say about the Haredim, but I think it's possible. I'm also got one eye on the clock. You focus on the nature of Jewish Israeli society, and you note, and I'm going to quote again. Some of these quotes are great. I mean, I feel like putting them on T-shirts, but it's a looming danger by which Israeli Jews' indifference of matters of what would usually be termed Jewish tradition might bring about a national political, as defined in the Zionist outlook, disintegration. That's the end of quote. there's now an effort to stave off this danger, and you talk about this in I think the next chapter, through the establishment of what they call the Jewish Identity Administration, which is already quite odious and kind of from the dimension, which notably is located inside the Ministry of Religious Services, which is and such a phenomenon seems to play directly to your argument. And a further comment which is mine, through your discussion of the birthright of the Taglit program, we seem to see a strange diametric opposition where, on one hand, diaspora Jewish Jews, in other words, those who have some sort of Jewish religious identity, they don't even have to be halakhically Jewish, right? But they, are helped to gain knowledge about Israel, which they lack, and on the other, Israeli Jews are helped to gain knowledge about their Judaism, which they lack. So perhaps you can maybe talk about these, maybe I've got it all wrong, but it's...
This is a central theme of the book, and it's a central feature of Israeli politics. I think, again, there's no way of understanding either Israeli politics or the politics of Israel in the Middle East without accounting for the fact that from a very early stage, even before the state itself was founded, among the new Yishuv or the Zionist settlement in Palestine, and then throughout the history of the state of Israel, this anxiety, what you would put on your shirt, this is not my words. This is the message broadcasted time and again by officials from the Israeli secular elite.
Right.
Noting that they are viewing a development where the next generation and then the generation afterwards become more and more indifferent and detached and ignorant from their Jewish identity or from their sense of Jewish history and their understanding of the meaning of Jewishness, not Judaism, but Jewishness.
Right.
And it's clear that if the state, which is a matter of fact of its self-definition, understands itself as state of the Jews, then there's a need to maintain the Jewish identity. This is done in different ways. Primarily, I guess, the state does it, the state does it through its tools. So there's a statist educational system, which used to be monopolistic almost. So you do it through education. You educate the kids to know that they're Jews, that this is their identity, this is their state. But also through the imposition of certain decrees on the public sphere that makes it apparent that it's the public sphere of Jews, right? If you're not Jewish, you can see the fact that the Saturday, Shabbat, is the day of rest, right? It's not your day of rest, but it's the day of rest of the state, so it's, and so forth. But it's interesting to know the degree to which there's an opposition to this. The most recent opposition is titled under Hadatta, or religionization, where this, I have to stress, nationalist motivated, Zionist motivated set of practices, legislations, and other governmental initiatives are all identified as an attempt to coerce seculars to be religious, which is, I think, it's a complete misreading of the situation. But also, and this is what you noted too, a very interesting differentiation between Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews.
Right.
And if we go back to the nation-state law itself, its history shows us how it happens. At one of the early stages, before it passed into law, the bill also suggested that the state would encourage the education of Israeli Jews to know their religious tradition or something like that. I can't recall exact phrasing. This was taken out because it was read to be forcing religion on, again, as a religionization. What they didn't take it out completely, just that Israel would encourage the learning and education of Jewish religion in the diaspora. Right. So the religionizing effort is legitimate when it happens with diaspora Jews, because it is seen as a way to encourage them to also see Israel as their state.
Right. Plus, they're all Reform Jews, so they need some proper religioization.
Well, I guess all denominations equally, in a sense. If our audience knows anything about the emissaries, the Shlichim program of the Jewish Agency, these are members of the, Israel. Well, they're emissaries of the Israeli government, basically sent to largely synagogues, but not only synagogues, Jewish centers, to educate American Jews how to be Jewish, which is, Think about it for a second.
Well, I mean, having come from North America, yeah. I mean, there's a not just a certain irony, massive irony. So in any case, and in your opinion, can there be any as such thing as non-Jewish Israeli nationalism? Is it even possible? I remember writing a few years ago in an article that, you know, today we talk about Jewish food, but we also talk about Israeli cuisine, Israeli music. We do have all this on a cultural level, but could we have non-Jewish Israeli nationalism, do you think?
Yeah, well, you know, the point where it comes to a head most explicitly in the relatively short history of Israel is, well, large scale, this Canaanite movement, the New Hebrews, basically advocated a non-Jewish nationalist Hebrew identity. I think, well, my book is not about them, and I think there's some problems in it, but I note the fact that they've always been a looming threat to this Zionist identity crisis because they offer a viable answer to it, at least ideologically a viable answer to it. But in the shorter span of history, let's say the last couple of decades, it has been attempts by descendants of the New Hebrews, primarily Uzi Ornan and his fellows, to demand that the state registers them or identifies them as members of the Israeli nation.
Yeah.
So this is, I guess, one way to answer your question. Formally, the Israeli state and then its court have decided that there is no Israeli nation. There's no such thing. It does not exist. And it reiterated, both sides reiterated that Israel rules in the name of the Jewish nation, not of the Israeli nation. Right. Israel is not the nation state of the Israelis. It's the nation state of Jews. This is what Israel has said time and again. Now, is it possible for Israel to develop an Israeli national identity that is inclusive in the sense that both Jewish identities and non-Jewish identities can cohabitate and claim the state as their own nation state? I think conceptually it's not hard to imagine this happening. Right. But we have to account for the fact, we have to pay attention to the fact that this would most likely mean the ceasing of existence of Israel as a Jewish state as Israel understands it. Right. So it would demand Israel to reform itself or its self-understanding in such a way that would be inconsistent with its current raison d'etre.
So how do you think it would look then? Or in your opinion, how do you think that we could solve this puzzle?
I don't play this game, you know, and this is obviously one of the questions that people are always left with after reading my book. So what is your program? I'm not here to offer a program. I'm not an ideologue. I think it's easy to imagine several paths in which the politics can develop. Maybe the most current political argument is for Israel to become a state of all of its citizens. Yeah. So a nation state of its inhabitants, where no group has. So it again, to stop being a Jewish state. I think it's still, you know, a program that needs to be clarified regarding its details. Yeah. We can also imagine maybe a little farther, but easier to imagine, some sort of tribal confederate system where different groups, let's call it tribal. Tribal is a negative word today, but
right. I know what you mean. Yeah, sure.
Like more parochial, local identities, all cohabiting under some federal system.
Of course, this was in fact, ironically, Ernest Bevan's suggestion at the end of the mandate, as they realized it was going to, as they say in Latin, going to hell in a handbasket. You know, it was not, and so he kind of tried to throw up this idea of, you know, where they were kind of grasping at straws to try and make it work, and just before they referred to the United Nations. So it's quite interesting. We've got only a few minutes left, but I think maybe we've been talking, really focusing inwards about kind of Israeli and diaspora Jewish communities, but there's certain important external dimension to what you're talking about, and perhaps how, in a few words, how does this relate to the overall Israeli ongoing, by the way, Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Yes, you know, this goes to this last topic we discussed. We have to note that the objection to partition,
yeah,
which then amounted to a request for either the imperial rule to continue or for the mandate rule to continue or for a return to some kind of an Ottoman Empire structure, right, has been the position of many Jewish critiques of Zionism.
Right.
or Jewish opposition to Zionism.
Yeah.
So the famous, for example, just to note it very quickly, the famous status quo letter from Ben-Gurion to the Agudat Israel was sent against the background of Ben-Gurion's fear that Agudat Israel, when meeting the Peel Commission, would express its official position that the mandate should continue.
Right.
Now, this, I think one way of understanding it, it is an opposition to the colonial created and then Zionist reaffirmed dichotomy that separates Jew and Arab as mutual opposites.
Right.
But this is history now. The reality now clearly is that Israel is based on this idea that Arab and Jew are mutually excluding, that they are opposites of each other, which goes to say immediately something about how Israel views itself in the Middle East. Sure. It goes immediately to say something about how Israel understands its a large minority of non-Jewish Palestinian Arabs. When Netanyahu raises, for example, in 2010, the demand that the Palestinians identify Israel as a Jewish state as part of the negotiations, we don't need much more than this to understand how the Jewish identity and the conflict are tied in together.
Right. I guess before we go, I mean, one thing I forgot to say, I introduced you as my colleague. I didn't say where or how. Yaakov is the Stanley Lewis Professor of Israel Studies at the University of Oxford and a fellow of St. Anne's College. But I suppose before we go, I just wanted to know, because this book is now, although it came out last year, which means it was written a couple of years ago, I suppose. What are you working on now? What kind of directions are you going? Where's your head at?
I think my main interest right now is to further develop this idea of what a Jewish perspective on Israeli and Zionist politics would be. And it's interesting to kind of dig up some of those very coherent, very fascinating voices that for some reason are being underread or maybe pushed aside in the in the Israeli discourse.
For example, I mean,
I think maybe to give a couple of examples. I mean, two of the men I've been reading and are Baruch Kurzweil and Leon Roth or Chaim Yehuda Roth. Both of them at one point, at least both of them part of the Zionist project themselves. Both of them academics who've taken part in the creation of the Israeli academia, but both of them presenting very interesting Jewish informed critique of the way Zionism, political Zionism has developed.
Right. Okay. So Yaakov, I think we're just about out of time. So I'm always worried that Zoom's going to cut us off and then kind of leave it. But I wanted to thank you so much for meeting with me today. It's always a pleasure. And
thank you.
and all the best for the future.
Thank you.